Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Regulation of Precision Medicine. It is presented by Neil A. Belson, JD, a lawyer at Potomac Law Group in Washington, D.C. Mr. Belson handles transactional and regulatory compliance matters and focuses on legal matters relating to precision medicine, life sciences, information technology, and health IT. I am Judy O'Rourke of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box that appears on the screen. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Help Desk button located in the promotional board at the bottom center of your screen, or use the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're having a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Belson. I will now turn the presentation over to him.
Thank you. I'm Neil Belson, and I'm going to be speaking with you today about the regulation of precision medicine and just a few words about how I got into precision medicine. As you will see, this is a field that both from the legal perspective and as well as the scientific is continually evolving. It affects a very wide range of industries. It affects remarkably diverse area of legal aspects as well, and I just couldn't think of anything that would be more interesting to do for the rest of my career than to be a part of the evolution of the legal and regulatory framework of one of the most cutting-edge areas and one of the most exciting areas of law, medicine, and science. So I'm going to speak about a number of recent developments in the regulation of precision medicine. There are so many recent developments in the area of precision medicine that, in all honesty, someone could probably pick about as many areas as I'm not going to cover as the ones I do and make a good case for why those and not the ones I will cover should have been discussed. Nonetheless, I hope that this will give you a good overview of some of what's taking place in the legal and regulatory field regarding precision medicine. Now, a few background notes. I'm going to briefly discuss the FDA regulatory scheme because most of my talk will focus on FDA. First, understand that FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine. FDA requires drug and device manufacturers to demonstrate that their products are safe and effective for particular uses and only allows them to include on their labels the uses which specifically have been approved by FDA. However, it doesn't regulate those of you who are physicians in your practice, and it does not preclude you're using medicines for off-label purposes. In fact, as you will hear, off-label use sometimes contributes to some of the development of evidence that supports precision medicine. One important issue that will come up in precision medicine, another background issue, is the issue of informed consent. A lot of precision medicine revolves around the use of genetic or health data of individuals, whether they're patients or just volunteers who contribute their information. And within the area of informed consent, there are two types of information, really two types of consents that need to be considered. The first is HIPAA. which you are probably familiar with as physicians. And to disclose protected health information requires HIPAA-informed consent. And should be noted with HIPAA that if the information is de-identified so that it's not traceable back to the subject, this does not mean just removing the name. It means removing a lot of additional information that could be such as address and phone number and many other types of information that can make the information back to its source. But if it has none of that identifying information, that's not subject to HIPAA regulation. Also, informed consent as a research subject is also subject to regulation. And the subject needs of a research study, for example, doing genomic research on a patient's data to develop new devices or drugs, that requires a separate consent from the patient, which describes the kinds of uses to which the data may be used, and it also requires the patient to be advised, or the subject to be advised who will receive the information and what are the possible purposes. And oftentimes in practice, both consents will be included on the same form. Okay, now to precision medicine, basically a who's who of the federal agencies that are involved. I'm going to speak mostly about the Food and Drug Administration's role. They have almost certainly been the prime mover on the regulatory side of precision medicine. I'm going to particularly focus on the product development side of precision medicine. And in that regard, FDA regulates the safety and effectiveness of drugs and medical devices. They're the ones who must approve commercial marketing of drugs and devices, and they can take enforcement action if the products fail to maintain that safety and effectiveness standard. Another important agency, which I'll briefly touch on, is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, because they're the ones that handle Medicare coverage, and basically their approval for coverage of a precision medicine of a product is very important in its commercial value. So they also regulate test laboratories for all purposes except research on humans, for all purposes except research. Two other agencies that I will briefly touch on, NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, is mostly focused on research and development rather than on the regulation of precision medicine. And they have what's known as the All of Us program, where they're seeking to obtain 1 million individuals across the country who have agreed to make available their health data and genetic records for research purposes. Similarly, the Veterans Administration has what they call the Million Veterans programs, doing with a similar goal of getting 1 million veterans to contribute their data so that they can do research on medical conditions of relevance to veterans. A brief rundown of the general regulatory system for drug and devices. FDA is for drugs. They're the ones that approve drugs for commercial marketing. And I'll speak briefly about the drug regulation. The standard that they use to determine whether a drug can be marketed or a new use of a drug approved is what they call safe and effective. And drug development is not cheap and it is not short. Tufts Center recently at the University of Tufts University recently calculated the cost of developing and getting approved a new drug as $2.6 billion for one drug. That's including many failures, and it can take 10 plus years. And I've listed the two centers within FDA that are involved in drug evaluation and approval. Brief synopsis of the drug development process. The first you start with basically drug discovery and optimization. That's where a company identifies potential drug candidates. Once it gets an active lead, it tries to optimize that lead by tweaking the initial compound to make it more potent and less risk of adverse events. Then they have to do preclinical studies, which are normally done on animals, which, although I should mention, and I'm not going to touch on this briefly, FDA is looking to develop and very exciting development. FDA is looking to reduce its use of animal studies and use more in vitro and simulated tests. And we can do a whole nother presentation on that very exciting development. But for now, preclinical testing usually involves animal studies. If those continue to be promising, both in terms of the effectiveness and the low toxicity of the compound, they can submit an investigational new drug application to FDA. And if FDA does not object and place a hold on the investigation, they can go ahead and start clinical or human testing. Phase 1 is a fairly small and short test where they take healthy patients and just test the drug for safety. Phase 2, they do effectiveness as well. It's larger. They do effectiveness studies. They do dosing studies and, of course, continue to monitor safety. And then phase 3 is the largest, usually involving a large number of sites. Now, what's noteworthy about the traditional clinical trial process is only about 12% of the drug candidates that start human trials ever achieve actual commercial approval from FDA. So this is not only an expensive process, it's a very inefficient one. I briefly talk about some accelerated approval programs that FDA and expedited approval programs that FDA operates that, while not directly limited to precision medicine, often affects precision medicine drug candidates because so many of them are directed at products that would that address unmet and high urgency needs. I'll talk about the accelerated approval program allows FDA to approve a drug if it demonstrates an effect on a surrogate endpoint rather than on, for example, the final disease and the patient's response to the final disease. But a surrogate endpoint considered likely to predict the clinical outcome, you can be approved under that accelerated approval program, and it's relevant, very relevant to precision medicine because that surrogate endpoint often is a biomarker. It's available, as noted on the slide, for drugs which can treat a serious condition and provide a meaningful advantage over what's currently available. And that meaningful advantage could be any of several things. It could be more effective, it could be less adverse effects, or it could treat a segment of the population which is not effectively treated under existing therapies. For example, oftentimes, very often, a drug will only effectively treat a portion of the people suffering from a particular disease. And if your drug treats a different segment than what's treated by current therapies, that would also be the basis for qualifying for the accelerated approval program. And your product can get approved faster than otherwise would, although you almost certainly have to do post-marketing testing to verify that, yes, that surrogate endpoint was in fact a valid endpoint, and yes, the drug is effective against the endpoint condition. There are several other expedited approval programs that I'm just going to briefly show the slides and not discuss, just so you have a sense of what else is out there. There's a fast track program, and again, you can get my presentation and you can then we'll get more details on some of the other expedited approval programs. There's no need to discuss all of them here. There's the breakthrough therapy, the priority review, and some of those programs allow expedited review by FDA. Once you submit the new drug application, they may allow FDA to assist you in drug development. They're generally targeted toward unmet needs or significantly improved drugs candidates, which are peer superior to existing products and address serious conditions. Now, I'll briefly go over the FDA's medical device regulatory scheme, also very relevant to precision medicine. And they have three classes of medical devices. Class 1 is the lowest risk products. Class 2, which is quite relevant to precision medicine, as you'll see, is a moderate risk product that generally requires a pre-market notification known as a 510K, in which you demonstrate that your device is quote unquote substantially equivalent to a currently marketed or what FDA calls a predicate approved device. And class 3 are drugs that present greater risk where there's insufficient evidence to show that the drug is safe and effective. And that class could be very important for precision medicine because if there isn't a predicate or pre-existing device in a particular category, normally you would automatically be submitted to this more rigorous class 3 classification. However, FDA also has a tool that allows FDA to classify low to moderate risk devices as a class 1 or class 2, even if there is no analogous pre-existing device. As you'll see, that turns out to be very important from the standpoint of some very important precision medicine device products in development. Brief overview of the history of precision medicine regulation in the federal role. In 2015, President Obama, in his State of the Union address, announced what he called the Precision Medicine Initiative within NIH that ultimately has led to what's now that All of Us program I referred to. Within FDA, it led to FDA's establishing a community platform it calls Precision FDA, currently in beta, where they are looking to basically develop a collaborative community for conducting bioinformatics research and development, and also looking for new approaches within regulatory science. Another major impetus for federal involvement in precision medicine was the 21st Century America's Cures Act, passed by Congress and enacted toward the end of 2016, which funded precision medicine research and of quite a lot of significance. For this presentation, as you'll see, it required FDA to develop a program for quote-unquote real-world evidence. It also excluded certain software functions, including those that some that have a medical support function from regulation as devices, and also addressed another number of issues that, while not directly and exclusively a part of precision medicine, are quite important to its development, such as it emphasis attempts to increase healthcare interoperability and prevent or limit information blocking. The created a breakthrough device track, and various other things that I've listed here. Now, I will talk briefly about FDA guidance documents. Very important for how FDA has regulated precision medicine. If FDA waits for Congress to enact legislation. That will take a long time and be generally very nonspecific. And regulations, similarly, the path to promulgate a new formal regulation is slow, and quite likely, because of the rapid development of precision medicine, adopting formal regulations, by the time they are formally promulgated, FDA could find that its approaches are obsolete or inaccurate because everything is so rapidly evolving. Instead, they've relied heavily on what they call guidance documents. We'll talk about several. Those are non-binding documents that represent what FDA calls its current thinking on a particular topic, and which should be viewed as recommendations. They usually issue a draft guidance document, they get public comment, and then they issue a final guidance sometime afterward. It could be a little over a year. They've issued some that are a couple of years old, and the final guidance is still not available. And both the drafts and the final guidances are available on FDA's website. Now, of all the topics I'm going to discuss, the one I'm going to spend the most time on here is real-world evidence. Real-world evidence is such an important part of precision medicine that there are a number of conferences that specifically are limited and focus on real-world evidence. And the significance of real-world evidence is that it is a prospective alternative in many instances to randomized clinical trials, those inefficient product development paths that take over $2 billion and usually fail. And as noted, the 21st Century Cures Act required FDA to develop a regulatory program for real-world evidence. In fact, a lot of the activity has taken place more on the device side to this point. And in addition to their cost and low success rate, there are a number of deficiencies with the traditional clinical trials. For example, they may not simulate the actual product use. Clinical trials often involve patients that are between 18 and 65 years old, but it may be that the actual population likely to use a drug is older than 65. If the disease is rare, you may not be able to get enough of a patient sample to do a meaningful clinical study, and you may not be able to do a meaningful, you may not be able to include patients who have comorbidities in a traditional clinical study because they have because their existence of many diseases creates too many variables. So it would be ideal to develop replacements. And that is the basis of an important FDA guidance document on real-world evidence by FDA's Device Center that was issued last year. And you will see when I discuss these guidance documents and other regulatory initiatives, how many of them took place within the last 12 months. That is evidence of how quickly this field is evolving. This one by the Device Center. And also the Biologics Center, which regulates a small portion of devices as well, contributed in this. Now, what exactly is real-world evidence? Well, first of all, real-world evidence is not the same as anecdotal data or anecdotal experience. Real-world evidence is clinically valid evidence it's clinically valid evidence that comes as a result of an actual clinical study design. FDA distinguishes between what they call real-world data, that's the anecdotal stuff, and real-world evidence. electronic or EHRs, insurance claims data, disease registry data, data that a patient may obtain from self-monitoring devices. FDA considers all of that to be real-world data. It's often generated not with a regulatory purpose in mind. For example, EHRs may be put together more with an eye toward maintaining a record of the patient's health and for insurance claims purposes. That's by itself, that is not real-world evidence. That's not useful necessarily for a regulatory submission. Real-world evidence, as FDA considers it, is clinical evidence obtained by using real-world evidence. Real-world evidence, as I'll explain, requires a careful study design, but done properly, it can replace those traditional clinical trials in certain instances. Specifically, real-world evidence can be used instead, and this is basically developing real-world evidence can be used instead of a randomized clinical trial or as a supplement to reduce the size of a traditional clinical trial to perhaps add new uses on a device label, new FDA-approved uses to generate post-marketing data that FDA may require as a condition of granted accelerated approval. If you're doing a clinical study, it can be used to, on a traditional clinical study, you can use real-world evidence to generate data from your control group. You can use it to demonstrate that a biomarker that you're using to measure whether or not your drug works. You can use real-world evidence to demonstrate the validity of that biomarker, that it is a meaningful and accurate reflection of the disease. And I should also note that safety and efficacy, the safe and effective standard that is required for clinical studies and drug approval also applies to any study of real-world evidence. And here, I'd like to talk about how you generate a real-world evidence study. You can use data from retrospective studies. For example, it could consist, you could go back and look at claims data. You could go back and look at disease registries. And you could use prospective data. You could say, we're going to, for example, for our device, we're going to prospectively set up a registry to monitor all uses of our device. And they will you will systematically collect data from EHRs, from the registries, perhaps from others, so from insurance claims, and it can be prospective as well. You can see it, or it can be both. You can use both retrospective and prospective data. The key issue, the point is that you would approach FDA and similar to a clinical study, excuse me, you would, excuse me, please. Similar to a traditional clinical study, you would say, we have this hypothesis, we believe that this device is effective for measuring this, and it will have this effect. And the difference is that rather than having to set up new clinical trials, you would collect your data from actual patient use from those registries, and you wouldn't necessarily have to do, or you could do less of those randomized clinical trials. And in fact, last year, FDA actually approved a new indication of a device based entirely on real-world evidence. This, as you see there, was a transcatheter aortic valve replacement, and they approved a new procedure. And the way they did it is, when the product was originally approved, the manufacturer set up a registry, and over the course of 100,000 uses by physicians, hospitals, etc., there were 600 records of off-label valve-in-valve procedures, and they demonstrated the device's use for this valve. These 600 off-label uses demonstrated the safety and effectiveness of this valve-in-valve procedure, and as a result, the company was able to get approval from FDA for this additional procedure with their device without having to do any new clinical trials. All of this was developed on patient records which were generated after the device was approved for its first use. And this allowed FDA was actually, I believe, the 42nd national regulatory agency among the various countries to approve the initial use of the procedure because of their then slower procedures around 2010. But because they used real-world evidence, they were the first regulatory agency internationally to approve this additional use. And so the significance of real-world evidence is that it can be a much less expensive, much more accurate, because it monitors actual use of patients of a device or ultimately a drug in real-world context with actual real-world patients. Much faster path to get, less expensive, much faster path to get regulatory approval, and a much more meaningful path to getting it because the data is based on actual use on real patients. So the real-world evidence could basically be a game changer from a regulatory perspective in the development of new drugs and new devices. And FDA has highlighted the need for real-world evidence because right now there's not really a system for aggregating the kind of data that will that would support real-world evidence conclusions, not what there ought to be. EHRs and other claims data is collected using many systems, many not designed for regulatory submissions, and opportunity and information is about not being used as it could, and opportunity is being lost. And FDA hopes that by expressing its willingness to accept regulatory submissions for approvals based partially or even entirely on real-world evidence, it can create incentives for this kind of systematic collection of information. And the NEST that I list here is actually an initiative at FDA to create a voluntary network of partners to link and synthesize their real-world data to improve the universe of available information that can support real-world evidence applications, regulatory submissions, basically create a broader universe of data from which to draw conclusions. And they actually have 11 proof of concept projects in this program on their website. I'm going to talk about another area that in precision medicine that FDA is active in, genetic variant databases. These variant database, genetic variants, are basically talking about mutations, and studying these genetic variant databases can be a very valuable resource in identifying what are the potentially significant genetic variations. This is done by comparing, for example, the genomics of patients who are healthy with those who have a particular disease condition, trying to identify if there are specific genetic differences that characterize those diseases, and that can be the basis for developing drugs and devices that treat them. But very often the database about genetic variations is not available to the public. It's in proprietary databases of R&D companies, for example, could be pharmaceutical companies. And if you look, FDA recently issued a guidance document that addressing this very point. If you look at the data, it was issued April 2018, give you an idea of how current so much of this activity is. And the goal is to encourage greater deposition of genetic variant data into public databases that are available to the general public, to the researchers, to product developers. And this guidance that FDA published, basically it says that publicly available databases that meet the standards laid out in the second bullet point could be used to support the clinical validity of genetic variant assertions. And what that means is basically, if you're claiming that a device or diagnostic product is useful for testing against a certain condition, and you're claiming this genomic variation, this genetic data isn't, or this biomarker is an indication of the particular condition, you can use evidence from a publicly available database to say, yes, in fact, this condition or this genomic pattern or this biomarker is in fact linked to the disease that your device is monitoring or testing. And the greater the information that is in the public genetically variant database, the more tools that product developers will have, the more data they will have from which to identify relationships between disease and certain biomarkers or genomic variations. The more they'll be, the faster they will be able to, or the more effectively, hopefully, they will be able to develop tests. And this is quite useful for new generation sequencing or NGS based testing and others. Now I'd like to talk about another recent initiative, and related to what I just said, recent initiative by SJ relating specifically to NGS-based tests. And the problem is FDA's original regulatory framework for diagnostics was developed for diagnostics that only measure a limited number of analytical analytes or analytical markers. So they published a new guidance addressing that, published the same day as the one I just mentioned, just in April. And this is specifically, I apologize, I said new generation, I meant to say next generation sequencing. And this is, again, published just 2 months ago. And the FDA is stressing that it adopted a flexible and adaptive approach to regulating NGS-based tests. And I mentioned earlier that the significance of that quote unquote de novo process. Basically, a lot of, if I can go back a second, they're specifically focused on aiding in the diagnosis of suspected germline diseases. These are genetic diseases that were either inherited or new genetic diseases that arose de novo in a particular individual. And in most cases, I don't believe that there are any currently marketed diagnostics that monitor germline diseases, which would mean they're all, because there's no predicate or pre-existing marketed device, they're all de novo. They all have to go through that pre-market approval process, it would normally mean. However, because of that de novo process, FDA is basically able to say that next generation sequencing diagnostics, which meet the consensus standards it's developed for measuring such products, are quote unquote de novo, and they get the class 2 classification instead of requiring a full pre-market approval, basically analogous to a new drug application set of studies. They can basically go through the pre-market notification of a 510K, even though they're the first of their kind, if they appear to present low to moderate risk. Another important area where FDA is active, and as you'll see also the CMS, which is involved with Medicare, is the area of companion diagnostics. Now, companion diagnostics are devices which provide specific diagnostic information that are essential for safe and effective use of a specific drug. Basically, it means that the companion diagnostic device will indicate, for example, it could indicate any of several things, but it could indicate if the drug is appropriate for a particular patient. It could indicate whether or not the drug is effective for that particular patient. But basically, it could indicate whether the particular disease condition which the therapeutic treats exists, or it might indicate genetic information indicating that a patient is or is not suitable to be treated for a particular therapeutic. And in this case, FDA has only issued a draft guidance as they solicit comment prior to developing a final one. And they actually companion diagnostics are not new, although to precision medicine, although they are a very important part of precision medicine. You can see a list of existing companion diagnostics right now. And FDA strongly recommends here, as in other areas, that you meet early with the agency to generate, if you have a companion diagnostic, that before you initiate drug trials, they strongly recommend that you have a companion diagnostic ready ready along with your drug candidate, so that in fact you can test the two and develop the two together, basically using the device to verify that the drug is safe and effective. Now, here I'm not going to talk. I haven't talked a whole lot about CMS, but it's noteworthy that CMS, the Medicare agency, and FDA have a parallel review program, which allows both agencies to concurrently review devices, including companion devices. And in fact, just recently, I should say that this parallel review program has actually approved 2 devices, including an NGS-based testing device, under this parallel review program that allows both CMS and FDA to review and simultaneously or substantially simultaneously approve a product, thereby assuring that not only is a product approved, but it's also covered under Medicare as soon as it's approved. Very important, the question of reimbursement. And CMS just recently issued what they call a national coverage determination, indicating that certain NGS tests for advanced cancer, which were FDA approved or cleared, can receive Medicare coverage if assuming all conditions are met. And the knowledge that you could have that your approved product would also be eligible for Medicare coverage creates important incentives for product development, and for physicians, important incentives for product use. Another area that is likely to only become more active, and the FDA de novo process was recently used to approve for the first time a direct-to-consumer genetics test, which is used to evaluate use for consumers. ordinary customers to evaluate an individual's genetic disposition to certain diseases and medical conditions. So this is an overview of some and by no means all of the hot regulatory topics, but just a few concluding thoughts. First of all, the pre-existing regulatory scheme that existed was developed not intended for precision medicine. And FDA and other agencies have often demonstrated quite a bit of flexibility and creativity in making possible the rapid advance of precision medicine. If you're involved in product development, I would strongly recommend you approach the agencies, and especially FDA early and often in product development. They want to help you. They want to learn about your technology and your products as they're in development, so they become educated and so they can provide their input early on. They don't want to see you for the first time when you're submitting a product approval. And obviously another key takeaway of what I've said is the regulation of precision medicine is constantly evolving, and quite likely anything I've told you today would be different 6 months from now. So I thank you very much for listening. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions or would like to discuss further any of the topics I have discussed or any other topics I haven't discussed relating to the regulation of precision medicine. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Belson, for that informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question drop-down box located on the far left of your presentation window. Type your question into the box that appears on your screen and click the Send button. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. So let's get started. Our first question is, could real-world evidence replace clinical trials?
Well, real-world evidence, if I had to pick one topic that I find particularly exciting of all of the many topics I've addressed, real-world evidence would certainly be up there at or near the very top, because it has enormous potential to reduce the cost and time of developing new drugs and products and devices, to reduce the cost, to reduce the time, to make it possible to study rare diseases, and to basically generate more usable information in clinical trials because it more accurately simulates accurate real-life conditions. Having said that, in some instances, real-world evidence could, and in the case I mentioned, has replaced clinical trials. It's probably best in its element when you have a product on the market and you're using real-world evidence to support additional indications for that product, because it's being used on the market, it's being used by real-life consumers, and you're generating actual information of clinical use. In that regard, it's strongly advisable to, if you want to contemplate additional indications for your product, when you're speaking with FDA to get that initial approval, you might want to contemplate setting up a product or disease registry to measure that all uses of that product in a particular context. Now, where its pathway is less clear-cut right now might be the initial approval of a, say, for example, a new drug, because you wouldn't necessarily have that body of patients being treated with a product from which you could generate that real-world usage information. So in such cases, you might be able to still use real-world evidence as a control, because you can monitor the real-world use of what currently is on the market and measure that against your traditional clinical data for the new product. But I still have hopes that it could be used universally, but the pathway to replacing traditional clinical trials for, say, a new drug candidate that's a new chemical entity is much less clear-cut.
Well, thank you for that. Looks like we have time for one more question. How would all of this information help me as a physician?
Okay, in a lot of different ways. For example, the real-world evidence, and this is the whole purpose of precision medicine, is intended to assist clinical practitioners in making more informed decisions. The genetic sequencing tests and the products that utilize it might be able, for example, to identify you might see the symptoms of disease, you might not know the causes. And in fact, what we're finding out is a lot of seemingly similar diseases actually have quite different genomic or other underlying causes. And that's probably the reason why most drugs only work against a certain portion of the disease population. The development of genomics-based tests, genomic-based analysis of patients' information could give you more information as to what is the underlying cause. And instead of relying simply on a first line and a second line medication given to all patients for a particular system, you might be able to make a much more informed judgment about the underlying genomic or other cause. You would all real-world evidence of information discussed here, a body of evidence as to what has worked for other patients in similar situations. So you have a much greater database of information available to you from other patient usage. The genomic data being developed through use of the various databases would create more linkages between different symptoms, different biomarkers that you could use to determine what is what you're seeing and whether or what is a particular disease, pairing biomarkers or genomics with a particular disease or set of symptoms, and also measuring whether or not a particular drug or other treatment is actually impacting that indicator biomarker. So it's going to help you make more informed decisions. It will about what the patient is suffering, about whether a drug is working, about what has worked with other patients, and be able to help you diagnose which of any number of causes why a patient is or isn't responding, which of any number of potential causes actually is the cause of your patient's symptoms. So, and also the new regulatory pathways being developed, such as those for real-world evidence, could result in faster and more useful products than what you have now.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please.
No, that's fine. Basically, it could give you faster and more precisely targeted products than the remedies you have now. Additionally, I would also point out there are companies that provide services where they can do database analysis of a particular patient, and they are claiming that this has resulted in higher and better patient outcomes. It's almost, and we're just beginning. Just as we're beginning, regulations are always evolving these days. We're just beginning to find out all the potential uses of precision medicines, and quite possibly we've only scraped the surface of how it could affect clinical practice.
So interesting. I would like to once again thank Mr. Belson for his presentation. I would also like to thank LabRoots for making today's educational webcast possible. Before we go, I want to let everyone know that today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through September 21st, 2018. You'll receive an email from LabRoots letting you know when this webcast will be available for replay. Please share that announcement with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Bye.